The first snowflake of winter fell like a whisper on the dusty streets of Silver Ridge. By dawn, the entire town was blanketed in pristine white, transforming the rough frontier settlement into something almost peaceful. Almost, but peace was the last thing on anyone's mind that morning when they dragged Elena Martinez to the town square. Chapter 1. The gathering storm. The bell tower chimed 7 times, its bronze voice echoing across the valley. Most mornings, this sound meant the start of another ordinary day. Shopkeepers opening their doors, children running to school, ranchers heading out to check their cattle. But this morning was different. This morning, the bell was a call to judgment. Jackson Cole pulled his wool coat tighter as he stepped out of the general store, a bag of supplies slung over his broad shoulder. At 32, he had the weathered look of a man who'd spent most of his life under the open sky. His dark hair was streaked with early gray, and his blue eyes held the quiet wisdom that came from years of watching, listening, and thinking before speaking. The crowd was already gathering in the town square. Men, women, even children pressed together, their breath creating small clouds in the cold air. Jackson had seen crowds like this before, and they never ended well. "What's all the fuss about?" he asked Martha Henley, the baker's wife, who stood at the edge of the group clutching her shawl. Martha's face was tight with concern. "It's that Martinez girl," she whispered. "They're saying she's the one who's been stealing from the church collection. Father McKenna found his lockbox empty yesterday morning." Jackson frowned. He'd known Elena Martinez for 3 years, ever since she'd arrived in Silver Ridge with nothing but the clothes on her back and a determination to start fresh. She worked as a seamstress, kept to herself mostly, and never caused trouble for anyone. "Elena," he said. "That doesn't sound right." "Well, someone saw her near the church late Tuesday night," Martha continued, her voice dropping even lower. "And you know how people talk. They're saying she's been desperate for money, what with her rent being behind and all." Jackson's jaw tightened. Small towns were breeding grounds for gossip, and gossip had a way of turning into truth, whether it was real or not. He'd seen good people destroyed by whispers and suspicion. The crowd parted slightly, and Jackson got his first clear view of the town square. His heart sank. Elena Martinez stood in the center of it all, her hands bound behind her back and tied to the old hitching post. Her long black hair hung in tangles around her face, and her simple brown dress was torn at the shoulder. Even from a distance, Jackson could see the purple bruise blooming along her left cheekbone. Sheriff Tom Bradley stood nearby, his badge catching the pale morning light. He was a good man, but weak when it came to standing up to public pressure. Beside him stood Mayor Aldrich, a thin man with sharp features who valued his position more than justice. "People of Silver Ridge," Mayor Aldrich called out, his voice carrying across the square, "we are gathered here today to address a serious matter. The theft of church funds is not just a crime against property, but a crime against God himself." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jackson pushed closer, his boots crunching in the snow. "The evidence is clear," the mayor continued. "Miss Martinez was seen near the church on the night of the theft. She has been struggling financially, and most damning of all, she has no alibi for that evening." Jackson looked at Elena's face. Her dark eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else there, too, a fierce pride that wouldn't let her beg, even in the face of false accusations. "What do you have to say for yourself, miss?" Sheriff Bradley asked, though his tone suggested he'd already made up his mind. Elena lifted her chin, and when she spoke, her voice was steady despite the tremor Jackson could see running through her body. "I am innocent," she said simply. "I did not steal from the church or anyone else." A voice from the crowd shouted back, "Then where were you Tuesday night?" Elena's composure cracked slightly. I was walking. I needed air. Walking where?" Another voice demanded. "Just walking." The crowd wasn't satisfied with this answer. Jackson could feel their mood shifting, growing uglier. Someone called out, "Liar." Another voice suggested they check her room for the stolen money. Elena's breathing became rapid and shallow. The fear in her eyes was growing, and Jackson realized she was on the verge of panic. "Don't look at me," she suddenly cried out, turning her face away from the crowd. "Please, just don't look at me like that." The desperation in her voice cut through Jackson like a knife. He'd heard that same tone before, in the voices of cornered animals and broken people who'd given up hope. That's when he made his decision. Chapter 2. A stand in the snow. Jackson stepped forward, his boots breaking through the crowd like a ship cutting through water. People turned to look at him, some surprised, others curious about what the quiet rancher might have to say. He walked steadily toward the center of the square, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. She had turned back toward the crowd when she heard the movement, and now their gazes met across the short distance that separated them. In that moment, Jackson saw something in her expression that confirmed what he'd already suspected. Elena Martinez wasn't a thief. She was a woman in trouble, surrounded by people who had already decided her fate. "Hold on there, Jackson," Sheriff Bradley said, as Jackson approached the hitching post. "This is official business." "I know what it is, Tom," Jackson replied calmly. He stopped directly in front of Elena, close enough that he could see the tears she was fighting to hold back. "And I know what it isn't." He slowly dropped to one knee in the snow, putting himself at eye level with her. The crowd fell silent, watching this unexpected development with fascination. Jackson reached out slowly, telegraphing his movements so he wouldn't startle her. His calloused hand gently cupped her chin, tilting her face up so she had to meet his eyes. "Look at me, Elena," he said softly, his voice meant for her alone but carrying clearly in the still air. "Look at me," she did, and he saw the fear there, but also something else. Trust, maybe, or at least the hope of it. "Now listen carefully to what I'm about to say," Jackson continued, his voice growing stronger, addressing not just Elena but the entire crowd, "because it's going to shock every single person in this town." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Even Mayor Aldrich seemed frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. Jackson's thumb brushed gently across Elena's bruised cheek, a gesture so tender that several women in the crowd drew sharp breaths. "Elena Martinez," he said clearly, "is going to be my wife." The words hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Gasps and murmurs erupted from every direction. Someone dropped something that clattered on the frozen ground. A child asked loudly what was happening before being quickly hushed. Jackson stood up slowly, turning to face the crowd while keeping one protective hand on Elena's shoulder. "That's right," he continued, his voice carrying the authority of a man who wasn't used to being questioned. "Elena and I have been courting quietly for months. We were planning to announce our engagement at Christmas, but I won't stand here and watch this town condemn my future bride based on gossip and fear." Sheriff Bradley found his voice first. "Jackson, that's quite a claim to make." "It's not a claim, Tom. It's a fact." Jackson's blue eyes swept across the crowd, meeting the gaze of anyone brave enough to look directly at him. "And I'll thank you all to remember that you're talking about a member of my family now." Mayor Aldrich stepped forward, his thin face flushed with either cold or anger. "Mr. Cole, even if what you say is true, it doesn't change the evidence against Miss Martinez. She was seen taking a walk," Jackson interrupted, "which isn't a crime last time I checked, but the money will probably turn up in some perfectly innocent place, just like missing things usually do." Jackson's tone was reasonable, but there was steel underneath. "How many times have we all misplaced something and been sure it was stolen, only to find it exactly where we left it?" Dr. Samuel Winters, the town physician, spoke up from near the back of the crowd. "Jackson's right about that. Just last month I was convinced someone had taken my medical bag, ready to accuse my own assistant. Found it in my buggy 2 days later." A few people nodded, remembering similar experiences. Jackson seized on this opening. "Think about what you're doing here," he said, his gaze moving from face to face. "You're ready to destroy a woman's reputation, a woman I love. Based on what? The fact that she took a walk? The fact that she's had some financial troubles?" Mrs. Henley shifted uncomfortably. "Or when you put it like that, there's no other way to put it," Jackson said firmly. "This isn't justice. This is fear talking. Fear of strangers. Fear of anyone who's different. Fear of admitting we might be wrong." Behind him, Elena had been listening to everything in stunned silence. The lies Jackson was telling to protect her should have made her angry, but instead she felt something entirely different. No one had ever stood up for her like this. No one had ever put their own reputation on the line to shield her from harm. "The church money will turn up," Jackson continued, "and when it does, I expect this town to remember how quickly they turned on one of their own." Father McKenna pushed through the crowd at that moment, his usually rosy face pale with cold and excitement. "Wait," he called out breathlessly. "Wait, everyone." All eyes turned to the elderly priest as he hurried into the center of the square, clutching something in his gloved hands. "I found it," he panted. "I found the money." Chapter 3, Truth in the Snow. The silence that followed Father McKenna's announcement was different from before. Where there had been tension and anticipation, now there was confusion and the first stirrings of shame. "You found it," Sheriff Bradley repeated. "Where?" Father McKenna held up a small metal box, its surface covered in snow. "In my own rectory," he admitted, his cheeks reddening with embarrassment. "I'd moved it there Tuesday night for safekeeping when I heard strange noises outside. Completely forgot about it in all the excitement, so there was no theft." Dr. Winters said slowly, "No theft at all." The priest confirmed. He looked across the square at Alina, who was still tied to the post, and his face crumpled with guilt. "My dear girl, what have we done to you?" The crowd began to shift and murmur, people suddenly unwilling to meet each other's eyes. The righteous anger that had brought them together was evaporating, leaving behind only the cold morning air and the uncomfortable realization of what they had almost done. Jackson felt Alina tremble behind him, and he turned quickly to untie her bonds. Her wrists were red and raw from the rope, and her hands shook as the circulation returned. "It's all right," he murmured softly, steadying her with his hands. "It's over now." But Alina wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the crowd, at all the faces that had been so ready to believe the worst about her, the faces that had watched her humiliation with satisfaction just moments before. "I need ... double quotes," she started to say, then stopped. She pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by everything that had just happened. Mayor Aldrich cleared his throat importantly, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "Well, this is certainly an unexpected development. Perhaps we should all just go home," Jackson said firmly, his arm moving protectively around Elena's shoulders. "I think enough damage has been done for one morning." The crowd was already beginning to disperse, people hurrying away as if they could escape their own participation in the near disaster. But Jackson wasn't finished. "Before you all leave," he said loudly enough to stop the retreating figures, "I want to make something clear." People paused, turning back reluctantly. "Alina and I," Jackson continued, looking directly at Alina as he spoke, "really are going to be married." Elena's eyes widened in shock. She opened her mouth to speak, but Jackson's gentle squeeze of her hand stopped her. "She's been through enough today," he said to the crowd, "so I'm asking all of you to respect our privacy as we plan our future together." This time when people began to leave, Jackson let them go. Soon the square was nearly empty except for a few stragglers and the official participants in the morning's drama. Sheriff Bradley approached them, hat in hand. "Alina, I owe you an apology." "We all do." Alina found her voice at last. "You do," she said quietly, "but I'm not sure an apology is enough." The sheriff nodded unhappily and walked away. Father McKenna approached next, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "My child," he said to Alina, "how can I ever make this right?" Alina looked at the priest for a long moment. "You can start by asking questions before you assume the worst about people," she said. "And you can remember this feeling the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on gossip." Father McKenna nodded solemnly. "I will. I promise I will." As the last of the officials drifted away, Alina and Jackson found themselves alone in the snow-covered square. The silence stretched between them, filled with everything that had just happened and everything that had just been promised. Finally, Alina turned to face him fully. "Why?" she asked simply. Jackson studied her face, taking in the bruise, the exhaustion, the lingering traces of fear, but also the strength that had kept her from breaking under pressure. "Because," he said, "sometimes doing the right thing is more important than telling the truth." Alina shook her head. "But you lied to them. You lied about us, did I?" The question hung in the air between them. Alina searched his face, looking for some sign of what he meant. "Jackson," she said carefully, "we barely know each other." "I know enough," he replied. "I know you're honest. I know you're brave. I know you were walking alone Tuesday night because you were worried about something, and you didn't want anyone to see you cry." Elena's breath caught. "How did you—" "Because I've taken plenty of those walks myself," Jackson said gently. "And I know what it feels like to have a whole town ready to believe the worst about you just because you're different, or alone, or because they need someone to blame for their own problems." Alina wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling the cold more keenly. "So what happens now? Do we pretend to court for a while and then have a quiet breakup?" Jackson was quiet for so long that Alina began to think he hadn't heard her. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful. "That's up to you," he said. "We could do that, if that's what you want, or ... or we could see if maybe, sometimes, lies have a way of becoming truth." Chapter 4. The Quiet Courage of New Beginnings. 3 hours later, Alina sat in Jackson's kitchen, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot coffee. She'd washed the dirt and tears from her face, and Jackson had gently cleaned and bandaged her rope burns. The bruise on her cheek was already beginning to fade from purple to a less angry shade of blue. The kitchen was warm and clean, with obvious signs of a bachelor's practical approach to housekeeping. Everything was functional but not particularly homey. Alina found herself wondering what it would look like with a woman's touch. The thought surprised her. She pushed it away. "Feel better?" Jackson asked, settling into the chair across from her. He'd changed out of his heavy coat into a simple flannel shirt that made his eyes look even bluer. Much, Alina admitted. Thank you. For everything. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind outside and the gentle crackling of the fire in the next room. Alina found herself studying Jackson's face, trying to understand the man who had risked his reputation to save hers. Can I ask you something? She said finally. Of course. Why aren't you married already? You're 32, you have your own ranch, you single quotes re ... She gestured vaguely at him. You're a good man. Why hasn't someone claimed you? Jackson smiled wryly. I was engaged once, 5 years ago, to a banker's daughter from Denver. Alina waited for him to continue. Catherine was beautiful, educated, everything a man was supposed to want in a wife. But she took one look at Silver Ridge and decided she couldn't possibly live in such a primitive place. She wanted me to sell the ranch, move to the city, become something I wasn't, and you said no. I said no. Jackson took a sip of his coffee. She went back to Denver and married a merchant's son within 6 months. I heard she's very happy. Alina nodded slowly. And you've been alone since then, by choice. I decided I'd rather be alone than settle for someone who didn't understand who I was. He looked at her directly. What about you? Ever been close to marriage? Alina's smile was sadder than his had been. Once, back in San Antonio. His name was Miguel. We'd grown up together, planned to marry after harvest season. What happened? His family lost their farm. Bad drought. Then his father got sick. Miguel decided he needed to marry someone with money. Someone who could help support his parents and siblings. Alina's voice remained steady, but Jackson could see the old pain in her eyes. He was probably right. It was the practical choice, but it hurt. It hurt, she confirmed. That's when I decided to come north, start over somewhere new. Jackson studied her face. And you've been alone since then too. Also by choice, Alina said, echoing his earlier words. I decided I'd rather be alone than settle for someone who would leave me the moment things got difficult. They looked at each other across the small table, to people who had chosen solitude over compromise, independence over security. So here we are, Jackson said eventually. Here we are. Alina agreed. The whole town thinks we're engaged. The whole town thinks we're engaged, and we barely know each other. We barely know each other, Alina repeated, but there was a note of question in her voice now. Jackson leaned forward slightly. But I'd like to know you better. Alina felt her heart skip. Even after what happened today. Even after seeing how this town treats outsiders. Especially after seeing how you handled yourself today, Jackson said firmly. You didn't break, Alina, even when they had you tied up and were ready to condemn you. You didn't beg or grovel or tell them what they wanted to hear. You held on to your dignity. Alina felt tears prick her eyes, but these were different from the tears of fear and humiliation she'd shed earlier. So what are you suggesting? She asked softly. Jackson reached across the table and took her hand. His was warm and calloused from years of ranch work, surprisingly gentle for its size. I'm suggesting we give this a chance, he said. Real courtship. Getting to know each other properly. See if maybe what I told that crowd this morning might actually come true. Alina looked down at their joined hands. And if it doesn't, if we discover we're not suited for each other, then we'll be honest about it. No one gets hurt, and we'll both have gained a friend. And if it does, Alina asked, raising her eyes to meet his. Jackson's smile was slow and warm. Then I guess I'll have to buy you a ring. Jackson's smile was slow and warm. Then I guess I'll have to buy you a ring. Alina laughed despite herself, and the sound surprised her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt like laughing. You know, she said, this is probably the strangest courtship proposal in the history of Silver Ridge. Probably, Jackson agreed. But then again, we're both pretty strange people. Alina considered this. It was true they were both outsiders in their own ways. Both people who had chosen difficult paths rather than easy ones. All right, she said finally. Let's give it a try. All right, Jackson echoed, and his smile was like sunrise. Chapter 5. The courage to begin again. 6 weeks later, Alina stood at the window of her small apartment above the dress shop, watching the snow fall on Silver Ridge's main street. The town looked peaceful in the white twilight, almost innocent. It had been an interesting 6 weeks. True to his word, Jackson had courted her properly. He'd taken her to Sunday dinners at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, where the other diners had watched them with curious but respectful eyes. He'd walked her home from work each evening, carrying her sewing basket and listening to her talk about her day. He'd brought her small gifts, wildflowers before the snow began, a book of poetry he'd ordered special from Denver, a warm shawl his sister had knitted. More importantly, he'd talked to her, really talked about his dreams for the ranch, his concerns about the harsh winter ahead, his memories of growing up in Silver Ridge when it was even smaller and rougher than it was now. He'd told her about his parents, both dead of fever when he was 20, and how he'd learned to run the ranch by making every mistake possible. Alina had found herself opening up in return, sharing stories she hadn't told anyone in years. Her childhood in San Antonio, her grandmother who had taught her to sew, her dreams of maybe opening her own dress shop someday instead of just working for Mrs. Garrett. They'd discovered they both loved books, though Jackson preferred adventure stories while Alina favored poetry and novels. They'd found they both had a weakness for apple pie and an inability to carry a tune. Jackson had learned that Alina was afraid of spiders but fearless around horses, while Alina had discovered that the tough rancher was surprisingly gentle with injured animals and secretly fed scraps to every stray dog in town. Most importantly, they'd learned to trust each other. The people of Silver Ridge had been watching this courtship with intense interest, partly out of curiosity and partly out of lingering guilt over the incident in the town square. The general consensus seemed to be that Jackson Cole was a lucky man and Elena Martinez was fortunate to have found such a protective husband-to-be. Elena smiled at that thought. If only they knew how protective Jackson truly was. 2 weeks ago, when Mrs. Patterson had made a snide comment about that foreign girl not knowing her place, Jackson had very quietly informed the woman that any disrespect toward his fiancée would be taken as disrespect toward him. Personally, Mrs. Patterson had apologized so quickly, she'd nearly tripped over her words. And last week, when Tom Bradley had suggested that Alina might want to attend the church social to show there were no hard feelings, Jackson had replied that Alina would attend if and when she chose to, and not because anyone expected it of her. Alina appreciated these gestures more than Jackson probably realized. She'd spent so much of her life trying to make herself small and invisible, trying not to give anyone a reason to notice or criticize her. Having someone willing to stand up for her, to claim her as worthy of respect, was a gift she was still learning to accept. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Jackson standing in the hallway, snowflakes melting on his coat shoulders. "Evening," he said with a smile that had become familiar and dear. "Thought you might like to take a walk, in this weather." Alina gestured toward the window. "It's beautiful out there, clean and quiet. Besides," Jackson's expression grew more serious, "I wanted to talk to you about something." Alina felt a flutter of nervousness. Over the past weeks she'd grown comfortable with Jackson, but she still sometimes worried that he might decide this arrangement wasn't working. Out she gathered her heavy coat and mittens, and they stepped out into the snowy evening. Jackson was right, it was beautiful. The snow muffled all sound except for the crunch of their boots and their visible breath in the cold air. The few lit windows they passed glowed warm and welcoming. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the edge of town, where the street gave way to the open land that stretched toward Jackson's ranch. Here, away from buildings and people, the night felt vast and full of possibilities. "Elena," Jackson said finally, stopping near a large oak tree that stood sentinel at the border between town and country, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." Elena's heart began to beat faster. "Of course." Jackson turned to face her fully, his hands finding hers through their mittens. "Are you happy?" he asked simply. Of all the questions Alina had been preparing herself for, this wasn't one of them. She repeated, "Here with me, with this arrangement we've made." Jackson's blue eyes were serious in the lamplight. "Because if you're not, if this is just something you're enduring because you feel obligated, then we need to talk about that." Alina stared at him, surprised by the question and even more surprised by her answer. "Yes," she said slowly, realizing as she spoke that it was completely true. "I am happy, happier than I've been in years." Jackson's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good, because so am I. Then why do you look worried?" Jackson glanced back toward town, then at Alina. "Because I think it's time we made this real." Alina's breath caught. "Real, Alina," Jackson said, and now there was something different in his voice, something deeper and more uncertain than she'd heard before. "These past 6 weeks they've been the best weeks I've had in a very long time, maybe ever." "For me too," Alina whispered. "I know we started this as a pretense, as a way to protect you from the town's judgment, but somewhere along the way, it stopped being pretense for me." Jackson's hands tightened on hers. "I love you, Alina. Not the idea of you, not the convenience of having you around, but you, your strength, your kindness, your terrible habit of humming off key when you think no one can hear." Alina laughed despite the tears that were suddenly blurring her vision. "You said you couldn't carry a tune either." "I said I couldn't carry a tune. I never said I minded when other people couldn't either." Jackson's smile was tender. "Elena Martinez, will you marry me? For real this time?" Elena looked at this man who had risked everything to protect her, who had spent 6 weeks showing her what it meant to be valued and cherished, who was now offering her a future she'd never dared to hope for. "Yes," she said, and the words seemed to crystallize in the cold air between them. "Yes, Jackson Cole, I'll marry you." Jackson's whoop of joy echoed across the snowy landscape. He picked Elena up and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, his kiss was warm and gentle and full of promise. When Elena asked when they broke apart, "Christmas," Jackson suggested. "Give us time to plan properly. Invite my sister from Colorado. Make sure Father McKenna has time to prepare something special." "Christmas sounds perfect," Elena agreed. They stood there in the snow, holding each other and looking back toward Silver Ridge. The town looked different now, not like a place of judgment and suspicion, but like home. "Jackson," Elena said softly. Thank you for what?" Elena pulled back enough to look into his face. "For seeing me, for believing in me, for giving me the chance to believe in myself." Jackson's expression grew serious. "Elena, you've saved yourself. All I did was buy you some time." Elena shook her head. "No, you did more than that. You showed me what it looked like when someone was willing to fight for me. I'd never had that before." "Well," Jackson said, pulling her close again, "you'll have it now, for as long as you want it." "Forever, then," Elena said. And she meant it. "Forever." Jackson agreed. As they walked back toward town, their footprints creating a new path in the snow, Elena thought about how much her life had changed in just 6 weeks. She'd gone from being a woman alone, suspected and scorned, to being a woman beloved and protected. But more than that, she'd learned something about courage. She'd thought courage meant enduring hardship alone, never asking for help, never letting anyone see your weakness. Now she understood that true courage meant being willing to accept love when it was offered. It meant risking your heart on the possibility of happiness. It meant believing that you deserved good things, even when the world seemed determined to prove otherwise. The snow continued to fall as they reached Elena's building. Jackson kissed her goodnight, a proper, chaste kiss that still made her heart race, and promised to call on her the next evening. Elena climbed the stairs to her apartment, her heart full of plans and possibilities. Tomorrow she would write to her cousin in San Antonio with the news. She would begin planning a wedding dress, something beautiful that she would make herself. She would think about what kind of wife she wanted to be, what kind of life she and Jackson could build together. But tonight, she stood at her window one more time, looking out at Silver Ridge sleeping under its blanket of snow. Somewhere out there, Jackson was riding home to his ranch, probably whistling off-key and thinking about their future. Elena smiled and began to hum softly to herself, the same off-key melody she'd been humming for weeks, not caring anymore who might hear. After all, she was going to marry a man who couldn't carry a tune either. And that, Elena thought as she prepared for bed, was just about perfect. Epilogue. Christmas morning. The church bells of Silver Ridge rang out across the valley on Christmas morning, their bronze voices carrying news of celebration and joy. Inside the small wooden church, every pew was filled with townspeople dressed in their finest clothes, their faces bright with anticipation. At the altar, Jackson Cole stood waiting, more nervous than he'd ever been in his life. He'd faced down wild horses, harsh winters, and financial hardship without breaking a sweat. But the thought of Elena walking down that aisle toward him made his hands shake. Father McKenna stood beside him, beaming with the particular joy that comes from officiating at a wedding where love is clearly present. The elderly priest had taken special care with this ceremony, partly out of lingering guilt over the incident in the town square, but mostly because he'd watched Jackson and Elena over the past months and seen something rare and precious growing between them. The church door opened, and Elena appeared. Jackson's breath stopped entirely. She was wearing a dress she'd made herself, ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and sleeves, simple but elegant. Her dark hair was arranged in soft curls, and she carried a bouquet of winter roses that Jackson's sister Mary had somehow managed to procure from Denver. But what took Jackson's breath away wasn't the dress or the flowers or even Elena's radiant beauty. It was the look in her eyes as she walked toward him, confident, joyful, and completely unafraid. This was a woman who had found her courage and her place in the world. Elena reached the altar and placed her hand in Jackson's, and he felt the rightness of it down to his bones. "Dearly beloved," Father McKenna began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have found in each other not just love, but the courage to embrace that love fully." As the ceremony proceeded, Elena found herself thinking about that morning in the town square nearly 3 months ago. She remembered the fear, the desperation, the certainty that her life in Silver Ridge was over. She could never have imagined then that she would end up here, surrounded by many of the same people who had been ready to condemn her, but this time receiving their genuine good wishes and blessings. People could change, towns could change, and sometimes, if you were very lucky, lies told in desperation could become the most beautiful truths. Do you, Jackson Cole, take Alina Martinez to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Jackson said, his voice strong and clear. Do you, Alina Martinez, take Jackson Cole to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for as long as you both shall live? Alina looked into Jackson's blue eyes, thinking of all the conversations they'd shared, all the quiet moments of understanding, all the ways he'd shown her what it meant to be truly cherished. I do, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Then by the power vested in me, by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Father McKenna beamed at them both. Jackson, you may kiss your bride. Jackson's kiss was gentle and reverent, a promise made public. When they broke apart, the church erupted in cheers and applause. As they walked back down the aisle together, Alina caught sight of Mrs. Patterson dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Sheriff Bradley tipped his hat respectfully. Even Mayor Aldrich seemed genuinely pleased. Outside the church, in the snowy town square where their story had begun, the newlyweds were surrounded by someone had organized a small reception at the community hall, complete with music and dancing and enough food to feed half the territory. As the celebration continued into the evening, Jackson and Alina found a quiet moment alone on the steps of the church. The square was lit with lanterns now, and snow was beginning to fall again. Any regrets, Mrs. Cole? Jackson asked, wrapping his arm around his wife's shoulders. Alina pretended to consider this seriously. Well, I suppose I'm stuck with a husband who whistles off-key, and I'm stuck with a wife who hums even worse. Jackson replied with a grin. They laughed together, the sound carrying across the snowy square where their love story had begun with fear and ended with joy. No regrets, Alina said softly, leaning into his warmth. Not a single one. Jackson kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair and the promise of their future together. Come on, Mrs. Cole, he said. Let's go home. Hand in hand, they walked into their new life together, leaving behind only footprints in the snow and the memory of a town that had learned to choose love over judgment. In Silver Ridge, some stories end with justice, but the best ones end with grace. The end.